I knew something was wrong before I even shut off the engine. You ever have one of those moments where your eyes see something, but your brain just refuses to accept it because what you're looking at makes absolutely no sense? That was me. After nearly 7 weeks overseas, I was exhausted, running on airport coffee and maybe 3 hours of sleep. All I wanted was to get home, drop my bags, and take a walk down my favorite trail. Now, that trail wasn't just some random path through the woods. It was part of the reason I bought the property in the first place. My place sat outside a small mountain town in northern Idaho, tucked against almost 12 acres of protected woodland. Years before I ever owned it, there had been an old footpath winding through the trees. Over time, I maintained it, cleared fallen branches, repaired washouts after storms, and worked with local conservation volunteers to protect native plants along the route. The trail crossed a seasonal creek, followed a ridgeline, and disappeared in some of the most peaceful forest I've ever seen. Deer used it. Bird watchers loved it. I loved it. So when I rounded the eastern bend that afternoon and saw bright, white painted lines cutting across the forest floor, I actually stopped walking. For a second, I thought jet lag was messing with me. Right there, dead center of protected woodland, sat a full-size pickleball complex. Not a portable setup, not a temporary court. A permanent sport facility. Fresh concrete, chain-link fencing, professional lighting, benches, even a small viewing area. The thing looked like it belonged at a private country club. I just stood there staring. The trail disappeared beneath the concrete and reappeared on the opposite side. It looked like somebody had dropped an entire sports center into the middle of a forest. My first thought was simple. Contractor mistake. Maybe somebody crossed a property line by 10 feet. Maybe 20. Maybe a survey marker got moved. Then I opened the property map on my phone, and my stomach dropped. Every inch of that structure sat on my land. Every single inch. The crazy thing was, I already knew who did it. About 2 months before my trip, a couple named Bryce and Amanda Holloway had purchased the estate next door. They moved in from Denver with a lot of money and the kind of confidence that tends to arrive in luxury SUVs. At first, they seemed friendly enough. Bryce especially. One afternoon, he wandered over while I was clearing branches after a windstorm. He wore brand new outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen dirt before. He asked about wildlife, conservation programs, property boundaries, local trails. At the time, I thought he was simply trying to learn about the area. Looking back, I think he was gathering intelligence. Because during that conversation, I specifically told him the trail was private. I pointed out the conservation markers. I even explained that portions of the woodland were protected under environmental agreements. Apparently, none of that mattered. I pulled out my phone and called him immediately. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, Ethan," he said cheerfully. "Back from your trip?" I skipped the small talk. "Why is there a pickleball court on my property?" Silence. Not confused silence. Not surprised silence. The kind of silence people make when they're deciding which excuse sounds most believable. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, that," he said. "We thought that trail was abandoned." I remember gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. "Abandoned?" I said. "It's protected woodland." He sighed. The fake friendliness disappeared instantly. "Look," he said, "our contractor said nobody was using it. Besides, the courts look great. People can still walk around them." Walk around them. Through dense forest. Around a giant slab of concrete that never should have existed. I told him the entire facility sat on my property. I told him I had surveys, records, boundary maps. His response came fast. "Then get a lawyer." Just like that. No apology. No concern. No hesitation. We're not tearing it down. And there it was. The real Bryce. Not the friendly new neighbor. Not the community-minded businessman. Just another guy who believed money could solve problems after he'd already created them. I hung up and started walking the perimeter. The longer I looked, the angrier I became. Construction crews had bulldozed native vegetation. They had compacted protected soil. They had destroyed restoration work that local volunteers spent years helping me build. What bothered me most wasn't even the concrete. It was the arrogance. Someone had looked at protected woodland, ignored every marker, ignored every boundary, ignored common sense, and decided their recreational project mattered more than everyone else's rights. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I called the only person I trusted to handle something this ridiculous. My attorney, a guy named Jack Mercer. After listening to my explanation, he stayed silent for several seconds. Then he asked one question. "You taking pictures?" "Yeah." "Good," he said. Another pause. Then his voice changed. "Because if what you're describing is accurate, your neighbor just made the most expensive mistake of his life." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. I figured we'd send a legal letter, maybe negotiate, maybe settle. What I didn't realize was that Bryce wasn't planning to back down. And the deeper we dug into what he'd done, the worse it was about to get. The next morning, I met Jack at his office, and if you've ever worked with a good attorney, you know they have a certain look when they think something is bad, and a completely different look when they realize it's much worse than they expected. Jack spread survey maps across a conference table and started comparing property records, easement documents, county filings, and environmental agreements. I figured we'd spend days sorting through everything. Instead, about 20 minutes later, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "This isn't even close." I remember staring at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there isn't a gray area here." He tapped the survey. "The courts aren't partially on your property." Another tap. "They aren't mostly on your property." One more tap. "They're entirely on your property. Every fence post, every light pole, every square foot of concrete, the entire facility." Honestly, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably reckless. How does someone spend tens of thousands of dollars building a permanent sports complex without confirming who owns the ground underneath it? Jack wasn't interested in guessing. He immediately hired an independent surveyor to verify everything from scratch. 3 days later, the new report came back. Same conclusion. No discrepancy. No uncertainty. No confusión. Bryce had built the entire project on land that belonged to somebody else. Then things started getting serious. Jack drafted a formal demand letter requiring immediate removal of the courts, restoration of damaged habitat, and reimbursement for environmental mitigation costs. We gave Bryce 7 days. 7 days to fix the problem. 7 days to avoid court. 7 days to prove he wasn't as stubborn as he seemed. His response arrived through one of the biggest law firms in the region. And honestly, the letter was incredible. According to their argument, the woodland had been underutilized before construction. Underutilized, as if forests exist to maximize quarterly productivity. They claimed the sports complex provided value to the community. Community value. I remember sitting in Jack's office reading that phrase twice. Then 3 times. Then laughing. Imagine parking your truck inside somebody else's garage and arguing that you've improved the neighborhood because there's now more available transportation. That was basically their legal strategy. The letter even suggested I should appreciate having access to a premium recreational facility whenever I wanted. Jack smiled when he read that section. "Good." "What do you mean good?" "Let them keep writing things like this." The more Bryce talked, the better our case looked. Unfortunately, Bryce didn't stop talking. In fact, he doubled down. Every weekend the place became busier. Music blasted through portable speakers. Pickup trucks and luxury SUVs lined the access road. Groups of strangers wandered through sections of protected woodland, carrying coolers and folding chairs. The place looked less like a private court and more like a community sports tournament. One Saturday morning, I walked over to document activity for the case. There were probably 30 people there. Kids playing, adults cheering, dogs running loose. Nobody had any idea they were standing on private property. Bryce spotted me immediately. He raised a hand and smiled. The same smile people wear when they think they're winning. "See?" he shouted from across the fence. "People love it." I pointed toward a conservation marker near the edge of the clearing. "You're trespassing." He rolled his eyes. "My attorney says we're fine." Maybe his attorney actually said that. Maybe Bryce only heard what he wanted to hear. Either way, somebody was about to have a very bad month. As the weeks passed, Jack filed for emergency injunctive relief. That's when outside agencies started paying attention. And that's when Bryce's situation really began falling apart. Environmental inspectors visited the site. Biologists reviewed vegetation damage. Conservation officials documented soil compaction and habitat disruption. The reports weren't pretty. Sections of native ground cover had been destroyed. Protected plants had been removed. Drainage patterns had been altered. The more experts examined the area, the more problems they found. Suddenly, this wasn't just a property dispute. It wasn't Ethan versus Bryce anymore. Government agencies were involved. Environmental compliance officers were involved. Conservation groups were involved. And Bryce still didn't seem worried. If anything, he became more confident. Looking back, I think he believed money would eventually solve everything. People get trapped by that mindset sometimes. They assume consequences are negotiable, that rules are flexible, that ownership is just another obstacle waiting to be managed. Reality doesn't work that way, especially when documentation exists. And Bryce kept creating documentation. Every week, he posted photos online. Tournament photos, community event photos, drone footage, promocional videos. Then he started talking publicly about future expansion plans. Future expansion on property he didn't own. At one point, he gave an interview to a local business group discussing how the courts could eventually become part of a larger recreational campus. A larger campus. I remember sending the article to Jack. A few minutes later, my phone rang. He was laughing. Actually laughing. Your neighbor is building our case for free. Every photograph became evidence. Every interview became evidence. Every social media post became evidence. Bryce seemed determined to prove, in public, exactly what he'd done. Then came the hearing. The morning of the hearing felt strangely calm. Not because I wasn't nervous, because by that point the facts were overwhelming. Ownership records, survey reports, environmental findings, photographs, public statements. The evidence stacked up like bricks. Bryce arrived wearing an expensive tailored suit. Amanda sat beside him. Both looked confident, maybe too confident. Jack sat quietly reviewing notes. No dramatic speeches. No theatrics. Just preparation. When Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, everything changed. The room became very quiet. He began reviewing documents almost immediately. Then he started asking questions. Direct questions. Specific questions. The kind that don't leave much room for creative answers. Did you obtain a formal survey before construction? Bryce's attorney hesitated. Not a formal survey, Your Honor. Strike one. The judge wrote something down, then looked up. Did you independently verify ownership of the construction site before pouring concrete? Another pause. Another uncomfortable glance between attorney and client. No, Your Honor. Strike two. The judge wrote again. Then came the third question, the one that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Were you aware the area was subject to conservation restrictions? For a moment, nobody spoke. Not Bryce. Not Amanda. Not their attorney. Just silence. The judge looked over his glasses, waiting, and that silence told him everything he needed to know. For nearly 2 hours, he reviewed surveys, environmental reports, photographs, easement records, and construction documentation. The deeper he went, the worse things looked for Bryce. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. The room became completely still. Even before he spoke, I could tell something important was coming. And when the ruling finally arrived, it hit Bryce like a freight train. Because the judge wasn't talking about negotiations anymore. He wasn't talking about mediation. He wasn't talking about future discussions. He was talking about immediate consequences. And less than 48 hours later, heavy equipment would be rolling onto the property. What happened next was the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed in my entire life. The judge didn't waste time. After reviewing everything, he made it clear that ownership wasn't in dispute, the conservation protections were valid, and the construction had been carried out on private property without authorization. Then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. Immediate removal authorized. No waiting period. No special accommodations. No additional negotiations. The order was effective immediately. I still remember looking across the courtroom. Bryce looked stunned. Not angry yet. Not frustrated. Just shocked. Like somebody had finally introduced him to a reality he'd spent months pretending didn't exist. His attorney looked even worse. Jack, meanwhile, calmly closed his notebook, stood up, and whispered 4 words that still make me smile. Let's schedule demolition. The next morning, I met a contractor named Frank Delgado at the property. Frank had spent decades removing illegal structures, damaged foundations, and failed construction projects. He was one of those guys who didn't say much unless he had something worth saying. He studied the courts for a minute, folded his arms, and nodded. Well, he said, this thing picked the wrong place to exist. That might have been the funniest thing anyone said during the entire case. Everything moved quickly after that. Environmental officials coordinated restoration plans. Engineers documented conditions. Conservation specialists marked sensitive areas. Every step was approved. Every requirement was followed. Nobody wanted Bryce claiming later that procedures weren't handled correctly. Then demolition day arrived. Just before sunrise, heavy equipment rolled down the access road. The forest was quiet. Cool morning air drifted through the trees. Birds were beginning to wake up. And sitting in the middle of that protected woodland was a sports complex that never should have existed. The first jackhammer strike echoed through the forest. Crack! A long fracture shot across the concrete. Then another strike. Another fracture. Then another. Within minutes, the surface began breaking apart. The painted court lines disappeared beneath shattered concrete. Excavators moved in. Massive chunks were lifted into waiting trucks. Rebar emerged from the rubble like exposed bones. Workers cut it apart and hauled it away. The lighting systems came down next. One by one, the poles were disconnected, lowered, and loaded for removal. The chain link fencing followed. Then the viewing area. Then the foundations. Hour by hour, the entire project vanished. And I'll be honest, watching it happen felt incredibly satisfying. Not because I enjoy seeing things destroyed. I don't. In fact, I hated that any of this had happened at all. But every broken slab represented accountability. Every truck leaving the property represented consequences. Every piece of debris heading toward disposal represented a lesson Bryce should have learned months earlier. By the end of the first day, most of the courts were gone. By the second day, crews were removing the compacted base material underneath. Damaged soil was treated. Drainage patterns were restored. Native vegetation recovery plans were already underway. It felt like the forest was finally taking a breath after being forced to carry something that didn't belong there. Then came the moment I'll never forget. Late that afternoon, just as one of the final trucks prepared to leave, a black luxury SUV came flying down the access road. Bryce and Amanda jumped out. The look on Bryce's face was incredible. Pour dix billets. He stood there staring at the empty clearing. 48 hours earlier, there had been a thriving sports facility. Now there was rubble, equipment, restoration crews, and open ground. For several seconds, he didn't say a word. Then he exploded, yelling, shouting, pointing, threatening lawsuits, threatening appeals, threatening everyone in sight. At one point, he actually demanded that workers stop loading debris. Debris from a structure that had already been legally removed. I walked over and handed him a copy of the court order. That's why this is happening. He looked at the document, then at me, then back at the document. His face turned bright red. For a moment, I honestly thought he might lose control completely. Instead, he called the police. And somehow that made the situation even more surreal. 2 officers arrived. They reviewed the paperwork, reviewed the court order, spoke with the demolition supervisors. Then one of them walked over to Bryce. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. The demolition was legal. The order was valid. The property wasn't his. There was nothing they could do. Watching that reality finally settle and was almost painful. Almost. A few weeks later, Bryce made one final attempt to recover something from the disaster. He filed a claim seeking compensation for construction costs, materials, and alleged damages. According to the filing, he believed he was entitled to recover tens of thousands of dollars. That effort didn't last very long. The court dismissed the claim. More importantly, the judge determined that Bryce's own actions had directly created the dispute and ordered him to cover a significant portion of my legal expenses. By the time everything finally ended, he had lost the facility, lost the money spent building it, lost additional money fighting the case, lost credibility around town. And from what I heard afterward, several planned business partnerships quietly disappeared as well. As for me, I got something much simpler. I got my trail back. A few months later, I walked through the area on a quiet autumn morning. The lights were gone. The noise was gone. The crowd were gone. The forest sounded like a forest again. Wind moving through branches. Birds calling from deeper in the trees. The creek flowing below the ridge. If you hadn't known the story, you never would have guessed an entire sports complex had existed there only months earlier. Nature has a remarkable ability to heal when people stop getting in its way. And with enough distance from the conflict, I eventually realized this story was never really about property. Not entirely. The concrete was just a symptom. The real issue was entitlement. Some people become so accustomed to getting what they want that they stop checking whether they're actually allowed to have it. They assume quiet neighbors won't push back. They assume rules are suggestions. They assume confidence can replace verification. It can't. Property lines don't disappear because they're inconvenient. Laws don't bend because somebody spent money. Reality doesn't negotiate with ego. Bryce had multiple opportunities to avoid disaster. He could have verified the survey. He could have stopped construction. He could have complied with the demand letter. He could have removed everything voluntarily before the hearing. Instead, every warning became a challenge. Every piece of evidence became something to ignore. And every chance to fix the problem became another opportunity to double down. In the end, the forest recovered. The trail survived. The conservation area remained protected. And maybe that's the part that matters most. Not the court victory, not the legal fees, not even the demolition. It's knowing that something worth preserving was actually preserved. But here's the question I've wondered ever since. What would you have done? If you came home and found a permanent structure built on your property, would you have tried harder to negotiate? Would you have gone straight to court? And at what point does giving someone another chance stop being kindness and start becoming permission? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I have a feeling people are going to be divided on this one. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to them, I'd love to hear that story too.